At 6:12 a.m. on January 25, 1944, Corporal Thomas Briggs was attaching, without authorization, a piece of equipment he had constructed from a scrapped fuel tank and hydraulic lines he shouldn't have, to a P-47 Thunderbolt nicknamed Thunderbird at Bodney Airfield in England. This modification violated at least a dozen Army Air Force regulations. If it failed in flight, Captain Reynolds would likely die and Briggs would be court-martialed. If it worked, it could solve a problem that had caused the deaths of 8 P-47 pilots in the previous 6 weeks. Would it work? Briggs was the crew chief in the 353rd Fighter Group and was responsible for the maintenance of Captain Michael Reynolds's P-47. At 23 years old, the son of a farmer from Oklahoma, Briggs was lean and muscular from constant physical labor. He had been maintaining fighter jets for 14 months, having worked on P-40s in North Africa before being transferred to England to work on the new P-47 Thunderbolts. The P-47 was a true beast of a plane. Weighing 7 tons fully loaded, it was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. It was fast, heavily armed, capable of withstanding enormous battle damage, and able to keep flying. American pilots loved the Thunderbolt. It was robust, reliable, and terrifying to the enemy. However, it had a fatal flaw that killed pilots: engine failure during prolonged inverted flight. This problem arose during battles. When a P-47 inverted and remained in that position for more than a few seconds, a common occurrence during defensive maneuvers against German fighter jets, the engine ran out of oil. The R-2800's oil system relied on gravity and positive G-forces to supply oil to the engine. During inverted flight, gravity was pulling the oil away from the intake point. If the maneuver lasted long enough, the oil pressure dropped, the bearing seized, and the engine failed catastrophically. Pilots learned this the hard way. On December 8, 1943, Lieutenant James Parker performed an inverted somersault to escape an Me-109 over France. Parker remained in the inverted position for about 8 seconds as the German fighter missed its target. Parker righted the aircraft, pushed the throttle forward to follow. The engine locked up. The oil pressure was 0. The internal damage was catastrophic. Parker tried to glide the malfunctioning aircraft towards England, but failed and crashed into the English Channel. His body was never found. December 19th. Captain William Harrison, same scenario. He performed an inverted somersault to repel a German attack. The engine stopped when he righted. Harrison parachuted over Belgium and was captured by the Germans. January 3, 1944, Lieutenant Robert Chen. After an inverted maneuver, he experienced engine failure, crashed while attempting an emergency landing in France, and died instantly. By mid-January, 8 P-47 pilots from the 353rd Fighter Group had been killed or captured due to engine failures during or immediately after inverted flight. The situation was clear to anyone paying attention. Inverted flight, maintain position, engine stalls. Sometimes immediately, sometimes after 30 seconds, but always in the same order. Briggs reported this to Squadron Maintenance Officer Major Howard Clark. Clark said that engine failures during high-G maneuvers were documented within acceptable parameters in the technical manual. Pilots were required to limit the inverted flight duration to a maximum of 3 seconds. This was included in the flight procedures. If pilots exceeded this limit, the engine failure was considered pilot error, not a mechanical failure. Briggs argued that 3 seconds was not enough during the war. German fighters forced P-47 pilots into prolonged inverted maneuvers. Telling pilots, "Don't invert for too long," was not a solution in situations where standing upright meant being shot down. So, what did you think the solution was, or what kind of solution would you have come up with? Write your answer in the comments. Clark said the R2800 engine was designed and tested by Pratt & Whitney engineers. If there was a problem, the engineers would fix it. Field mechanics didn't have the authority to predict engine design. Briggs disagreed. He had grown up working on farm equipment in Oklahoma. These machines had to operate under extreme conditions with minimal maintenance. He understood mechanical systems. He knew what failed and why. The R2800's oil system worked well under normal conditions, but it wasn't designed for continuous inverted flight. The solution wasn't complicated engineering. It was an additional oil reservoir that could supply oil to the engine during negative G flight. He had been thinking about this solution for 2 weeks. The concept was simple: mount a small auxiliary oil reservoir high up in the engine compartment. During normal flight, oil would accumulate in this reservoir. During inverted flight, when the main oil system couldn't supply oil to the engine, the auxiliary reservoir would supply oil by gravity. Not much, maybe 2 liters, but enough to keep the engine afloat for 15 to 20 seconds of inverted flight instead of 3 seconds, narrow. This modification required components that Briggs didn't officially have access to: a small reservoir, hydraulic lines suitable for oil, check valves, mounting brackets. He would have to manufacture most of these himself, scavenging materials from damaged aircraft. On January 15th, Briggs approached Sergeant Dutch Hoffman in the materials depot. Hoffman was a pragmatic NCO responsible for parts inventory, who understood regulations that sometimes conflicted with operational requirements. Briggs explained the oil system concept. He showed Hoffman the drawings. Hoffman examined the drawings, asking technical questions about flow rates and pressure differences. Then he said, "This works, but you're talking about modifying engine systems without authorization. This is serious." "People die," Briggs said. "I know. I've seen the casualty reports." Hoffman looked around the materials depot. Other personnel were busy with inventory and orders. "There's a damaged P-47 behind the maintenance hangar. Nobody's keeping an eye on it. The salvage team won't be able to get to it for 2 weeks. If someone needed hydraulic lines or small fuel tanks from that plane, nobody would notice for a while." "What about the mounting brackets and fittings?" "There's scrap steel in the machine shop. Again, nobody's keeping a close eye on it." Briggs nodded. "Thanks for the information." "I didn't tell you anything," Hoffman said, "and I certainly didn't help you obtain unauthorized materials for unapproved modifications." "I see." For the next 3 days, Briggs collected materials from the damaged P-47, hydraulic lines in good condition, a small auxiliary fuel tank that could be reused as an oil tank, mounting brackets from the gun bay. He worked outside of regular hours to avoid attracting the attention of officers who might ask questions. He fabricated the remaining components in the machine shop during night shifts. He cut steel for custom mounting brackets. He machined fittings to connect the hydraulic lines to the oil system. He installed check valves, salvaged from hydraulic systems to control the oil flow direction. By January 18th, all the components were ready. Now, he needed to install them on a real aircraft. The question was, which aircraft would he modify first? The answer was clear: Captain Reynolds' P-47 Thunderbird. Reynolds was an aggressive pilot, flying the aircraft to its limits and frequently performing inverted maneuvers during combat. If any pilot needed this modification, it was Reynolds. Briggs approached Reynolds after his post-mission briefing on January 19th. He explained the oil shortage problem and his proposed solution. Reynolds listened, asked technical questions, and then said, "Does this modification affect normal engine performance?" "No, sir. The auxiliary tank only engages during inverted flight. At other times, it only serves as passive storage." "What happens if it fails?" "In the worst case, we revert to the current state. The engine stops after 3 seconds of inverted flight. In the best case, you get 15 to 20 seconds of inverted flight capability." Reynolds pondered. Major Clark would never approve of this. "No, sir, he wouldn't approve." "So we're talking about an unauthorized modification to my aircraft?" "Yes, sir." Reynolds nodded. "Do it. I'd rather go to a military court than be shot because my engine fails every time I do a backflip." Briggs made the modification on January 20th and 21st, working night shifts when the flight line was mostly empty. The squadron's senior engine specialist, Chief Sergeant Ray Martinez, found Briggs working on the second night. Martinez examined the partially fitted auxiliary oil system. "What is this?" Briggs explained. Martinez listened, then said, "This is unauthorized. You're modifying engine oil systems without engineering approval." "The system works. The theory is sound." "You don't know this. You haven't tested it in flight conditions. If this fails, Reynolds dies and you go to Leavenworth. If I don't fit this, Reynolds could still die if his engine fails during combat." Martinez was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Let me see your installation plan." Briggs showed him the technical drawings. Martinez examined the drawings for 10 minutes, checking the clearances, flow paths, and mounting points. Finally, he said, "Your return line is routed incorrectly. You've placed it in a location where engine vibration will cause fatigue, failure within 50 flight hours. Reroute it along the engine bay wall, add a flexible section here, and pointed to the drawing. Are you helping me? I'm not helping you do anything unauthorized, said Martinez. I'm just pointing out that if someone installs this system, which they absolutely shouldn't do without approval, they need to correct this route problem, otherwise they'll experience a catastrophic failure. Briggs rerouted the line as Martinez suggested. The change was completed at 4:00 a.m. on January 22nd. At 6:15 a.m., Major Clark arrived for his morning inspections and found Briggs and Martinez working on the Thunderbird's engine. Clark checked the auxiliary oil tank, hydraulic lines, and he examined the modifications in the engine compartment. His expression changed from curious to angry. "Corporal Briggs," Clark said, "what is this equipment?" "An auxiliary oil system, sir. It provides oil supply during inverted flight." "Who authorized this?" "A modification?" "No, sir." "Then remove it immediately." "Sir, this modification solves the engine failure problem. P-47s can invert for longer periods without running out of oil." "That's not something you can decide. You're a crew chief, not an engineer. Remove the modification immediately." Captain Reynolds arrived at that moment, saw the argument, and approached them. "Major Clark, what's the problem?" "Your crew chief has made unauthorized modifications to your aircraft's engine system." Renault looked at the auxiliary oil tank. "The system that provides oil during inverted flight? Did you know about this?" "I approved it." Clark turned to Reynolds. "Captain, you don't have the authority to approve engine modifications. This requires engineering assessment and group management approval. How long does that process take?" "At least 6 to 8 weeks. How many pilots will die from engine failures in 6 weeks?" Clark's expression hardened. "That's irrelevant." "It's completely relevant. Corporal Briggs identified a problem that was killing pilots. He developed a solution. I allowed it to be installed on my plane. If it works, it should work on other planes. What if it fails? What if the modification causes an engine failure and you die? Then I'll die. But I'd rather die testing a potential solution than die from a known problem while waiting for official approval." Clark looked at both of them. "Remove the modification. This is an order. If I see any unauthorized equipment on this plane tomorrow, you will both be charged." Reynolds began to argue. Clark interrupted. "Captain, you're relieved." "Corporal Briggs, you have orders." Clark walked away. Reynolds turned to Briggs. "Are you going to take it out?" Briggs looked at the Thunderbird, at the auxiliary oil system he had built over 3 days and assembled over 2 nights. He thought of Lieutenant Parker drowning in the English Channel, Captain Harrison being taken prisoner by the Germans, Lieutenant Chen dying in a French field, 8 pilots dead or missing because the engine couldn't handle inverted flight. "No, sir," said Briggs. "I'm not going to take it out." "Good," said Reynolds. "Neither will I." The mission briefing on January 25th laid out the task of escorting B-17 bombers attacking aircraft factories near Reims, France. 48 P-47s from the 353rd Fighter Group would provide high-altitude cover. Expected German fighter resistance, medium to heavy. Flight time, 3 hours, 15 minutes. Weather, clear over France with scattered clouds above. Channel. Reynolds was flying the Thunderbird in the 3rd rank of the Red Squadron. Briggs watched the P-47 take off from the runway at 8:45 a.m., disappear into the gray British skies. The auxiliary oil system was still attached. Major Clark had inspected the flight path at 7:30 a.m., but hadn't closely checked individual aircraft. He didn't know Reynolds was flying with unauthorized equipment. Briggs spent the morning working with the other aircraft, trying not to think about what would happen if the modification failed. If Reynolds' engine stalled at high altitude, if the auxiliary system caused a catastrophic failure instead of preventing one, Briggs would be held responsible. A court-martial would be the least of his problems. At 11:47 a.m., the P-47s returned. Briggs counted them as they landed. 39 aircraft, 9 missing, heavy losses. He watched each fighter land, searching for the Thunderbird. It wasn't in the first group, nor was it in the second. His chest tightened. Then he saw it, the Thunderbird on final approach, landing gear deployed, flying normally. The P-47 landed smoothly and proceeded to the parking spot. Reynolds shut off the engine and exited the cockpit. Briggs ran up to him. Reynolds was taking off his gloves, his face flushed from the oxygen mask pressure. "How did it work?" Briggs asked. Reynolds looked at him. "We were attacked by Me-109s over Rheims. 6 of them were diving from high altitude. To fend off the first attack, I turned sharply to the left, performed a backflip. I was in a backflip for maybe 12 seconds while 3 passed me. Then I came to a right position and got caught on the tail of 1. The engine? It kept running. Smooth power throughout the entire maneuver. The oil pressure never dropped. Reynolds took off his flight helmet. If it weren't for your modification, my engine would have stopped. I would be dead or captured right now. Instead, I dropped the Me-109 and returned home. Was there any problem with the system? None. It worked exactly as you said. It didn't affect normal flight characteristics. It only engaged when I needed it to." Martinez leaned closer, listening. "Are you sure the oil pressure remained stable during inverted flight?" "Absolutely. I was watching the gauge. Normally, during inverted flight, it drops below 20 pounds after 3 seconds. This time it stayed at 40 pounds throughout the entire maneuver." Martinez looked at Briggs. "Your modification is working." By afternoon, the news spread throughout the squadron. Reynolds briefed other pilots about the auxiliary lubrication system, explaining how it worked during combat. Pilots, having learned about how it worked, began asking their crew chiefs if they could have the same modification done. The crew chiefs requested technical details from Briggs. By evening, 5 more crew chiefs wanted to install the auxiliary lubrication system on their aircraft. Briggs showed them his drawings, explained the installation process, and helped them source materials from damaged aircraft. Martinez quietly assisted, demonstrating technical improvements and suggesting better routing for the hydraulic lines. Over the next 4 days, 12 P-47s in the squadron received Briggs's lubrication system modification. The work was done outside of working hours, using scrap materials, without official approval. Major Clark was focused on other maintenance issues and did not notice the unauthorized modifications spreading throughout his squadron. On January 29th, Lieutenant Carl Weber went on a mission in a P-47 with a modified lubrication system. His flight encountered German fighters near Nancy. Weber inverted his aircraft to avoid an FW-190 and remained in that position for 15 seconds while maneuvering. His engine did not lose power the entire time. He shot down the FW-190 and returned to base. That evening, Weber found Briggs in the maintenance area. "I was in an inverted position for 15 seconds. Before your modification, my engine would have stopped after 3 seconds. You saved my life today." By February 3rd, 28 P-47s had been fitted with this modification. Aircraft with the auxiliary lubrication system flew more aggressively, using prolonged inverted maneuvers that had previously been considered suicidal. German fighters had difficulty predicting American defensive tactics because P-47 pilots could sustain maneuvers that had previously led to engine failure. Then, on February 5th, a P-47 with a modified lubrication system experienced engine failure during a routine training flight. Pilot Lieutenant James Morrison was practicing aerobatics at 8,000 feet. He inverted, remained in that position for 20 seconds, then returned to a vertical position. The engine locked up 30 seconds later. Morrison made an emergency landing at a coastal airfield. There were no injuries, but the engine was completely destroyed. Major Clark immediately ordered an investigation. Engineers inspected Morrison's engine and found catastrophic bearing failure. The investigation revealed that Morrison's crew chief had incorrectly installed the auxiliary lubrication system. The return line had been routed through an area of excessive heat, contaminating the hydraulic fluid. The contaminated fluid circulated in the engine, damaging the bearings. On February 6th, Clark summoned all crew chiefs. "I order the immediate removal of all unauthorized lubrication system modifications. An engine failure has already occurred on 1 aircraft. The pilot's survival is a stroke of luck. These field modifications are unsafe and create more problems than they solve." Briggs stood behind the unit. "Sir, 28 aircraft have been flying with this modification for 2 weeks. There's only been 1 malfunction, and that was due to incorrect installation. The modification itself is sound." "That's not something for you to decide, Corporal. You're not an engineer. You don't have the expertise to assess engine system safety." "I've seen pilots die from engine failures during inverted flight. Since we installed the modifications, there haven't been any pilots killed for that reason. That's a measurable improvement." Clark's face flushed. "You will remove all unauthorized modifications immediately. Any crew chief who doesn't comply will be court-martialed. You are relieved of your duties." The crew chiefs dispersed. Martinez approached Briggs. "Will you comply?" Briggs thought of Reynolds's aerial battle over Ran, Weber's survival of the engagement near Nancy, the 8 pilots who died before the modifications were made. "No, I won't remove them. Clark will carry out the court-martial threat. Probably. But in the meantime, I'll have kept the pilots alive." Martinez slowly shook his head. "If you don't remove them, I won't order my crew chiefs to remove them either." That night, only 3 crew chiefs removed the modifications. 25 P-47s still had Briggs's auxiliary oil systems installed. Clark discovered this during an inspection on February 7th. He confronted Briggs and Martinez in the maintenance area. "I gave you both direct orders to remove these modifications. Why are they still installed?" Briggs looked him in the eye. "Because the modifications work, sir. Because the pilots survive combat they wouldn't otherwise survive. Because a court-martial is better than watching more pilots die from preventable engine failures." Clark looked at Martinez. "Sergeant Martinez, you're responsible for engine maintenance in this squadron. Why didn't you have these modifications removed?" "Sir, Corporal Briggs's design. I evaluated it. The concept is sound. The only fault wasn't a design flaw. It stemmed from incorrect installation. In good conscience, I couldn't order the removal of equipment that was preventing the pilots' engines from running." "The surviving pilots. Then you both face charges." Clark turned to leave, then stopped. "The group commander wants to see you, both of you." Today at 2:00 p.m. At 2:00 p.m., Briggs and Martinez reported to Colonel James Bradley, commander of the 353rd Fighter Group. They stood at attention in his office. Bradley was a 34-year-old fighter pilot with 50 missions to fly. He looked tired. "Gentlemen," said Bradley, "Major Clark has reported that you have made unauthorized engine modifications to 25 aircraft, refused orders to remove them, and encouraged other personnel to do the same. Is that all in summary?" "Yes, sir," said Briggs. "Tell me about these modifications." Briggs explained the auxiliary oil system, the problem it solved, its technical design, the installation process, and the combat results. Bradley listened without interruption. When Briggs finished, Bradley asked, "Since you started installing these modifications, how many pilots have we lost due to engine failure during inversion?" "0, sir." "How many pilots in the previous 6 weeks?" "Did we lose?" "8, sir." Bradley turned to Martinez. "Sergeant, you're our senior engine specialist. Is this modification safe?" "Yes, sir, when properly installed. The only failure was due to improper installation by an inexperienced crew leader. The design itself is sound. I've thoroughly examined it." Bradley leaned back in his chair. "I should court-martial both of you. You directly violated orders, installed unauthorized equipment, and undermined the chain of command." He paused. "But you also prevented pilots from dying. That complicates things." The room fell silent. Then Bradley said, "I'm sending your modification design to the 8th Air Force Engineering Department. They will properly evaluate it and decide whether or not to standardize it. Until then, the modifications will remain installed. They will not be removed, but there will be no further installations without my approval." "Understood?" he said. "Yes, sir," Briggs and Martinez said simultaneously. "Major Clark won't like this decision. He'll claim I'm rewarding insubordination." "Is that so, sir?" asked Briggs. Bradley smiled slightly. "No, Corporal. I'm rewarding life-saving innovation." "There's a difference." Rejected. The 8th Air Force Engineering Unit evaluated Briggs's modification for the next 3 weeks. They produced test versions, conducted engine dynamometer tests, and performed flight trials. Their conclusion on March 1st was, the auxiliary oil system was effective, safe when properly installed, and should be implemented on all P-47 units on the European front. The official modification order was issued on March 15, 1944. Pratt and Whitney engineers refined Briggs's design, created standardized components, and developed installation procedures. By May, more than 200 P-47s had factory-approved auxiliary oil systems installed. The effect of the modification was measurable. Engine failures during inverted flight fell from 43 incidents in December 1943, January 1944, to 6 incidents in March-April 1944. Pilot casualties from this particular cause decreased by 87%. P-47 pilots flew more aggressively. They used inverted flight. By performing more effective maneuvers, they achieved better combat results. Briggs was never officially recognized. The modification was called 353. It was described as field recommendations from fighter group maintenance personnel and improvements made by Pratt and Whitney engineering personnel. His name was not mentioned anywhere in the documents, but the pilots knew. Reynolds told everyone who heard about the crew chief who saved his life. Weber wrote letters mentioning Briggs's innovation. Other pilots spread the story in the fighter community. Briggs remained with the 353rd Fighter Group until the end of the war, maintaining the Thunderbird and Reynolds' subsequent aircraft. Reynolds flew 127 combat missions, shot down 8 confirmed enemy aircraft, and survived the war. He said that Briggs's modification saved his life at least 4 times during prolonged reverse maneuvers in combat. The war ended in May 1945. Briggs was discharged in August, returned to Oklahoma, and went back to farming. He didn't talk much about his military service. When his neighbors asked, he would say, "He was a mechanic. He repaired planes, that's all." But the auxiliary oil system lived on. During the Korean War, F-51 Mustangs, later P-51s, received similar modifications to address oil shortages during negative G maneuvers. Briggs's engineering principles became standard practice in fighter aircraft oil system design. In 1967, Briggs received a letter from Michael Reynolds, a pilot who flew the Thunderbird. Reynolds had remained in the Air Force and had been promoted to colonel in 1965. He had retired. He wanted to thank his crew chief, who had saved his life thanks to an unauthorized modification 20 years later. Reynolds wrote, "I flew 127 missions. In at least 40 of them, I was involved in serious dogfights. I used countermaneuvers that would have killed me if it weren't for your oil system. You gave me skills, advantages that German pilots didn't anticipate, and I survived when I should have died. Thank you for having the courage to break the regulations when regulations kill people." Briggs kept the letter in a drawer. He never showed it to anyone, but he read it occasionally when he wondered if he had made the right decisions during the war. In 1978, an aviation historian researching P-47 modifications found references to auxiliary oil systems in the 8th Air Force. Maintenance records. The historian traced the modification back through official channels, found engineering documents, but noticed something strange. The system had suddenly appeared in March 1944 with no prior development history. A complete design, improved by Pratt and Whitney alone. The historian continued his research, finding references in the 353rd Fighter Group records to field-appropriate oil system modifications in January 1944. He found Major Clark's report on unauthorized modifications. He found Colonel Bradley's decision to keep them installed. Finally, he found Briggs's name in a maintenance log entry. The historian contacted Briggs through veterans' records. Briggs, 66 years old, was still farming in Oklahoma. The historian questioned him about the oil system modification. Briggs corroborated the story, explained the technical details, described the problem and its solution. The historian asked Briggs if he felt cheated by having Pratt and Whitney's design attributed to him. Briggs thought for a moment, then said, "No. The modification worked. It saved pilots' lives. That was what mattered. Who was credited was just paperwork." The historian's research was published in an aviation journal in 1979. The article documented Briggs's modification in technical detail, included original drawings, and quoted from war reports illustrating its impact. The article characterized Briggs as one who implemented innovations despite institutional resistance, making a critical contribution to the P-47's combat effectiveness. Briggs read the article once, put it aside, and returned to farming. He retired in 1989 at the age of 68, spending his retirement restoring antique farm equipment and teaching mechanical skills to his grandchildren. In 1993, the United States Air Force National Museum contacted him. They were undertaking restoration work to make a P-47 airworthy and wanted to install an accurate auxiliary lubrication system based on his design. Would he agree to consult on the project? Briggs visited the museum in Ohio and worked with restoration experts for 3 days. At 72 years old, he produced a complete auxiliary lubrication system using the techniques he employed in 1944. The museum installed the system on their P-47s and displayed it at air shows. A plaque next to the restored P-47 read, "Auxiliary Lubrication System Modification, developed by Corporal Thomas Briggs, 353rd Fighter Group, January 1944, originally unauthorized. This field modification solved the critical oil shortage problem during inverted flight, implemented in P-47 units between 1944 and 1945. It is said to have prevented approximately 200 to 300 engine failures and contributed to the survival of numerous pilots." The museum asked Briggs to speak at the opening ceremony of the restoration. Briggs refused. He said he didn't like public speaking. Instead, the museum placed a photograph of a young crew chief in overalls standing next to the Thunderbird in 1944 next to the plaque. Thomas Briggs died in 2007 at the age of 86. 5 people who had flown P-47s during World War II attended his funeral. None of them had met Briggs personally during the war, different squadrons, different air bases, but they had all flown aircraft with his oil system modification. One of them, a retired lieutenant colonel who had flown in the 56th Fighter Group, placed a small metal piece in Briggs's coffin. It was an oil control valve from a P-47 auxiliary system that had been meticulously preserved for 63 years. The colonel quietly remarked, "This is what kept my engine running when it should have stopped. Thank you for giving us the ability we needed to survive." Briggs' family donated his technical drawings, photographs, and manufacturing tools to the Air Force Museum. These materials were joined by thousands of other artifacts documenting aviation innovation. The dramatic equipment visitors come to see isn't the planes or weapons themselves, but the field modifications that made those aircraft more effective. In 2012, an aviator researching fighter jet oil systems, a young engineering student discovered Briggs's documents in museum archives. The student was writing a thesis on field modifications and their impact on production design. Briggs's auxiliary oil system became a key case study. The thesis documented that Briggs's modification was fitted to approximately 1,200 P-47s between March 1944 and the end of the war. Engine failure rates during inverted flight dropped from 2.8% to 0.3% after implementation. Based on combat casualty data and pilot survival statistics, the student estimated that Briggs's modification contributed to the survival of 180 to 250 pilots. Conversely, there were also those who died from engine failures during combat maneuvers. The numbers were estimates and conservative estimates. They did not account for pilots who survived because they could perform more aggressive maneuvers, those who won engagements because their engines didn't fail during defensive maneuvers, and those who returned home damaged because their engines continued to operate under stress. The thesis concluded, Briggs's unauthorized field modification demonstrates that effective innovation often stems from personnel directly experiencing equipment limitations under operational conditions. The willingness to violate regulations in the service of operational necessity exemplifies adaptive problem-solving under organizational constraints. In academic terms, sometimes breaking the rules is necessary to save lives, and those closest to the problem often see solutions missed by engineers in the distance. The thesis was published in 2013. It included Briggs's drawings, installation procedures, combat reports, and interviews with surviving pilots who benefited from the modification. The document has become mandatory reading in various aeronautical engineering programs as an example of how field innovation can influence production design. Briggs never saw this thesis published. He had been dead for 6 years when it was released. However, the modification he made continues to influence aircraft design. Modern fighter jets utilize multiple oil pumps and accumulator systems that provide a continuous oil supply regardless of aircraft position or G-forces. The engineering principles are based on concepts Briggs developed in 1944 using scrap fuel tanks and hydraulic lines. Today, at the United States Air Force National Museum, Briggs's P-47 auxiliary oil system sits in a restoration workshop mounted on a flying P-47 that performs at air shows. When the aircraft inverts during a show, the auxiliary system engages, maintaining oil pressure and ensuring the engine runs smoothly. It works just as Briggs designed it 79 years ago. Next to the workshop bench is a folder containing 51 letters. Written between 1967 and 2006, the letters are from former P-47 pilots thanking Briggs for the equipment that kept their engines running when they shouldn't. Letters from crew chiefs who fitted his modification to their aircraft. Letters from engineers who reviewed his design and recognized its elegance. This is the true story of military innovation, not billion-dollar research programs or advanced laboratories. A 23-year-old farmer's son who understood engines, who saw pilots die from a solvable problem, and who, because waiting for official approval meant watching more people die, created a solution from scrap materials. Every P-47 pilot who used prolonged inverted maneuvers to repel German attacks owed that skill to Briggs. Every pilot who survived a conflict because their engine didn't stop during defensive maneuvers owed their life to an unauthorized modification built against regulations. Most never knew Briggs's name. Most never knew that the auxiliary oil system they relied on was designed by a corporal working night shifts with scrap materials. They only knew that their engines kept running when inverted, that they kept running when they needed the most power. But the reason they survived was because Briggs refused to accept that regulations were more important than lives. Because he saw a problem and he solved it. Because he understood that the best solutions come from people who confront problems directly, who are willing to act despite corporate resistance. If this story resonates with you, click the like button. Share this with someone who needs to understand what true innovation looks like. Subscribe so you never miss these forgotten stories. Stories of people who changed the war without seeking recognition, who saved lives without official approval, who understood that rules are meant to serve people, not the other way around. Leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if someone in your family served in fighter jet squadrons. Mention problem solvers, mechanics, innovators, those who overcame corporate resistance, the people who actually fixed things. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for keeping Thomas Briggs's story alive. These men deserve better than silence. They deserve recognition for what they actually did. They identified problems, developed solutions, implemented them despite regulations, saved lives because saving lives was more important than following procedures. That is the true heroism of war, not dramatic combat missions or medals. It's the quiet courage of people who saw problems, solved them, and accepted the consequences. The mechanics who kept the planes flying. The crew chiefs who changed equipment because the standard configuration was killing people. The problem solvers who understood that innovation requires risk and that risk is acceptable when lives are at stake. Thomas Briggs took that risk. He used unauthorized equipment. He refused direct orders. He faced potential court-martial. He did all this because he knew 8 pilots had died and he had the information to prevent more deaths. Every P-47 pilot who flipped their aircraft over and continued fighting. Every pilot who returned home safely because their engine wouldn't stop. They owed their survival to a crew chief who believed regulations were less important than keeping his pilots alive. If you've watched this far, share your positive thoughts about the war in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more WWII memories. Thanks for watching.